just the ability to understand your own identity and be able to express that identity gets caught up in the place you live, the time you're in, and the world there is. Right? That's an even a separate struggle that we see getting caught by the ebbs and flows of history, like you mentioned. I think of A Birth of a Nation and the fact that the only black characters that had lines in that movie were white actors in blackface. The only black um, archetypes in that movie were the dancing Negro or the black mammy or the uppity black man. Right, the only archetypes that were the ones that you could easily cast in a negative or a neutral light. And again, all played by white actors.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat. Just a quick note, this is actually part 2 of a conversation. So part 1 was released on YouTube on the 8th of March. It's called Black People Are Not a Monolith. So make sure you check that out before listening or watching this episode in particular. If you want the full audio version, it is on the audio feed of Genuine Chit-Chat on Spotify and every other podcast app. Plus, I will be talking to Tony Holt in the future about other Ralph Ellison works as well. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, check out all the clips and things as tasters for other videos that I release, and also make sure you check out the audio feeds on Spotify and all the podcast apps so you can tune in wherever you see fit. Primarily the people who are resistant to acknowledging that racism still exists and there's still baggage on both sides. You know, there's a lot of stuff that I can't remember if Ellison or Baldwin has said it in things outside of this, which is kind of like white guilt. A lot of it comes from the fact that the atrocities that were caused by our ancestors, whatever, and us not processing it or talking about it. And then it comes out in ways where sometimes it comes out in ways that are actually negative towards people of color. And other times it comes in ways which are trying so hard to not be negative. It loops around and becomes negative, as we spoke about earlier on in this conversation. And it's so
like
hard.
The Birth of a Nation versus affirmative action. And now the abolishment of DEI. Absolutely.
Exactly. That's it. And it's just like people, and unfortunately there's no right answer, which is the thing again, which Ellison and Baldwin say, because they go, how would you solve this? And they're like, there is no answer. There's not like so obviously pre-civil rights era, it was give us the rights and then we can start, we can kind of start to repair. But sort of, that's why I'll be interested when we eventually get to Going the Territory, because there is an essay I saw in there which I haven't read, it's called something like, what America would be like if black people never existed. And I wonder if it inspired Ta-Nehisi Coates in some way, because I've heard of that book you mentioned as well. Someone recommended that to me in a bookshop when I bought a Baldwin novel. But the thing is like, I think the way we get around that, although these essays are really important and very interesting, the main people who read essays are the people seeking this stuff out. So this is almost like level 2 of self-evaluation, historical discovery. But to get people like me to get from this neutral level of like ground zero to level 1 of, in a way, actually being a bit more switched on than other people about certain elements. I imagine most people in Britain can't name when the civil rights era happened. They might know approximately when MLK was killed. They don't know about Medgar Evers. They don't know about Malcolm X. They also would know about. They don't know about the importance of people like Baldwin and other members of the rights era, which I myself don't know a huge amount of, but I'm starting to get those bits. I think the main way you get that is by using fiction. And I think that's how you create sympathy and empathy. That's the way you do it. And the way it is, I think, for me, was one of my favorite essays, because it reads like fiction, but it's just him going to a woman in Harlem's house and just talking to her for however long, 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it seems. And that's how you get it. You have to get real people's stories, and you have to almost turn that into fiction so that the people who are resistant to their minds being changed, you can kind of incept them in a way, you know what I mean? Like that, and that's what happened to me. You know, I was still open to it, but Invisible Man was really the turning point of me going, oh, I really want to learn about this. And some of my friends have gone, why have you suddenly become so interested in black fiction? Because I've also, as well as Ellison and Baldwin, I looked at what the top 10 fiction novels were written by black British people. Majority of them are by women, which is something I didn't expect. There's no problem with that. But I think 8 of them were women in the last sort of 50 years, which is great, because again, I'm a guy, so I have even less of a understanding of what a woman's perspective is in day-to-day lives when it comes to prejudice. So I've started buying more books and things, but friends of mine have asked, why are you suddenly interested by black authors in particular? my whole thing, which it boils down to, is kind of what Invisible Man made me realize, is that obviously, I don't know anything about that experience, as in I hadn't unless I learned about it or I'm told about it. But actually, for me, the Black experience is something which I feel is so important to review, because unlike other demographics who are pushed against, like, I'm not anti-immigration, okay? But the truth of the matter is, immigrants, whether they're escaping war or they don't have any other options, they are choosing to enter your country, legally or illegally, to try and find a better life for themselves. The big difference in history for all other demographics, even people who are poor, you can go, oh, is there a reason you're poor? Did you not make this decision, that decision? When you go back in the roots and you trace it back to what a lot of issues are of the era of these writings, at least, the Black people suffrage, it's literally a huge amount, millions and millions and millions of people were taken from their country of origin against their will in horrendous conditions, spent about 400 years in slavery. Then, when they're out of the slavery, they then spend another 100 years fighting to just be treated as the same as other people. And this is while the people who are pushing down against them are the ex-slavers, in some cases still slavers. And it's this whole thing where it's like, it's such a massive concept to comprehend, but it's something that I'm trying to understand as best I can, because I think that, especially in America, it's just people of color, specifically Black people, when you go through their history, it is just unlike anyone else's. And it's just that kind of intrigue for me of why I'm so intrinsically bought in now. And I want to learn as much as I can through, again, that's why I was getting into American authors, but I was like, well, there's also British authors. And although the history of Black people being in Britain can be traced to the slave trade, definitely, there's also this whole stuff about the Windrush generation and us asking people in like other nations that we kind of controlled through the Commonwealth and etc. to help us fight our wars and things. And then when the war was done, we didn't really treat them that well and sent some of them back. And it's all, and again, it's this kind of scenario where it's primarily, instead, unlike immigrants or other people coming into your country, this is a group of people who didn't want to come to your country, centuries and generations of servitude, were finally released, just want to be treated the same as everyone else. Took another 100 years for that to happen, and it has not even been 65 years, it's not even that, it's been like 60 years since then, and it's still ongoing. And that's something that I want to say, because listeners might be like, why is Mike suddenly super interested by this? But I think once you go down that rabbit hole, it's a situation unlike any other.
One that, much to your point, is more present than America may be ready to deal with. I would say one that is more present than America has shown it is ready to deal with. Even now, as we see this large anti-DEI push coming from society writ large, if not the current administration, it's that fear, that concern, that not knowing how to process that history appropriately to make something better of it, right? It's that narrow lens of either good or bad, and we have to accentuate the good and forget the bad. It's that dichotomy. It's that fear that's stopping us from having that conversation. Whereas, prior to this administration, 10, 20 years ago during my youth, it was a different lens of good versus bad, right? It's good to be on the side of affirmative action and pushing Black culture and providing for minorities in more ways than not, right? And it's bad if you're on the side of saying that women and minorities don't need extra advantage and an extra leg up, right? I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna pretend like I'm not a product of affirmative action, right? I'm not gonna pretend like I didn't get benefits, scholarships. I didn't get extra looks and extra help because of the color of my skin and the country I came up in and the time I came up in during this country, right? At the same time, much like Ellison and Baldwin and all of his contemporaries, I also am not going to. I wouldn't say that is I'm not a product of that only. My success is due to the work that I've put in, uh, uh, um, the training that I've had, the effort that I've put in to become the person that I am, to build out my own identity. Right. Another one of the themes in Ellison's essay collection and themes that he struggles with, a big theme of that you see represented in Invisible Man is being able to tell your own story and craft your own identity, and uh, uh, um, the ability, or at times inability, for Black Americans to break out of those stereotypes and show their own complexities to the world. Right. I believe it was the essay. Uh, I believe it was the essay 20th Century Fiction and the Black Mask of Humanity, where he talks a lot about the struggle with names and naming, right? The struggle of his own name, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and trying to understand why his father named him after this white poet, stalwart of the transcendental movement. How that name, both he didn't understand it, tried to run from it, and then eventually realized that it fated him to become the great writer that he is potentially. Talking about the struggle of the movement in the 50s and 60s, where either certain peoples or certain religions would disavow the names of Black people, names that were given to us by slavers, by those who enslaved us, where they would disavow those names, especially Black Muslims, where they would take on new names to break away from the past and come into their own power. Right. It's things like that, where just the ability to understand your own identity and be able to express that identity gets caught up in the place you live, the time you're in, and the world there is. Right. That's an even a separate struggle that we see getting caught by the ebbs and flows of history, like you mentioned. You know.
Mm. And to linking in, I do want to get onto music in a moment, because Shadow Act Part 2, I think it really made me have a revelation about jazz and the blues. While you spoke about 20th Century Fiction and the Mask of Humanity, my note for it, like what I took away from it, because again, we'll read the same essays, but we'll both take different things from it. And not just because of our demographic and geographical location, but just different experiences and life and things, which is why essays can be so interesting. And it would almost be, if we had unlimited time and we got paid for this, it would be so great. Imagine just like once a week, do like an hour and a half on every one of these essays, because I think we could easily do it. But we'll have to stick to the overviews for now. But in this one, again, 20th Century Fiction, The Mask of Humanity, one thing I wrote, so this is my note, is society may have an impact and parameters, but that's not an excuse for white writers to perpetuate stereotypes that will harm them all within society. For the most part, it is down to Black people to represent themselves in art and writing, as well as in society. However, Faulkner uses stereotypes to show that there are human truths within his characters. And linking that with, it's either in that essay or in another essay of Ellison's, which is better than not showing any Black characters at all, because many white writers in the early 20th century, basically during the Reconstruction era, they just completely omitted Black characters, because so many of the people who are writers were like, well, I don't want to misrepresent. And Ellison's argument is saying, at least in this time when he wrote this, he was going, in some ways, obviously, although he would want a lot more Black people to represent themselves in media and art, in some ways, if a white writer uses a stereotype, as long as they show human truths within their character, which that's the quote from Ellison, the human truth part, if they do that and they use human truths, what you can then do is show to someone who only sees in stereotypes the human side of a stereotype, and show that a person, even if you are stereotyping them, which is wrong, even if you're doing that, if you can show these human truths, it means that you can change the mind of the people who are perceiving them. And that is more important to do, even though it can cause damage. It is more important to do something like that than completely omit characters from that demographic entirely. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on my reading of that element of that essay.
No, I love that idea. And it's the fine line between the erasure versus kind of doing harm, right?
Yes.
I think, again, because it's so fresh in my mind, I think of A Birth of a Nation and the fact that so the only black characters that had lines in that movie were white actors in blackface. The only black uh, um, archetypes in that movie were the dancing Negro, or the black mammy, or the uppity black man. Right, the only archetypes that were the ones that you could easily cast in a negative or a neutral light, and again, all played by white actors. It's just the idea that it's easier to not talk about something you don't understand is alluring, but then, like you mentioned, like Ellison alludes to, it's erasing a part of history that exists. It's removing a part of the complex reality of the world that you're writing about. Where at times it would at least be better to acknowledge that black characters, existed, black people existed in this story at the time. And while you may not have the ability to write about them, hey, that's why it's important to have black creators, to tell black stories, to be in the writer's room, to make sure to point out where people are going wrong, right? My biggest gripe with pop culture movies that come out, or movies and TV that come out now and show black people in the past, is when they give them so much more agency, or when they try to rewrite history to show black people in positions of power in the past. Not that it didn't happen, not that it didn't exist, but sometimes it comes out as a rewriting of history, as a recreation of what life was actually like, right? I've only ever seen one. While we're not going to get into my gripes about time travel movies, but I've only ever seen one time travel show send a black man in the past and have that black man ask, "Isn't it really a good idea to send me back into the past because I'm black?"
Yeah.
And it's those realities that, to your point, sometimes it would be better to write that character in a relatively ham-fisted way, to at the very least acknowledge the reality of the time, the complex reality of the time, that there were people who didn't there were people different in your story. And even if you can only tell a small portion of that story, telling that story at least gives more people a way into it, and helps broaden both the audience that can come into your story, as well as give your core audience an idea of different perspectives that they may not know or understand. Very much like the different perspectives you have gained by diving into Ellison, Invisible Man, and and the times of Reconstruction, and the black authors in Britain that you are mentioning as well.
100%, yeah. I agree completely. So I want to say, before we get into the music, there's a book that I mentioned, which I'm going to hold up to screen now. This is the book. So this book is Invisible Man is my favorite book ever. I read this book within 48 hours. Okay, it was that good. And what this book is, so it's Percival Everett's novel. He's got loads of books out, but it's a recent one. It's won loads of awards. It's won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Loads of people talking about this. And it's called James. And what it is, it's the character of Jim from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but it's his story from his perspective. And I've not read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I've not read Tom Sawyer. Up to this point, I had no real interest in it. But what's really interesting about this novel, what makes it so interesting, and this isn't a spoiler, this is revealed literally within the first chapter or the second chapter, the way they make this, basically reframing the character of Jim, the way it works so well, and one of the reasons why it's up there with my top 3 favorite books ever, is because what they do is the characters in there, and it's about linking back with one of my the favorite parts of our prior conversation about code switching, is that when Jim talks to white people, he talks in the way in which was likely more historically accurate at the time, which is sounding less educated. That Southern drawl, that kind of seeing a Southerner as simple, leaning into that stereotype, not just from the black perspective, but Southerners as well. But then when he speaks to other people who are, at this point, slaves, when he's speaking to other people, they're all eloquent. They speak properly. They have education, and they explain it in the book. It's not like a handwave thing. It's a specific part in the book where Jim at points talks to young black girls, and he's like, right, You just said that sentence. Perfect. Now, how would you say that sentence when you're around a white person? And they have to translate it into how a black person would have to speak, because they go, we can't let the white people of that time know how intelligent we are and know how organized we are behind closed doors. And I'm like, I imagine there were probably a few people in that era, in that region, who probably did have those kind of thoughts. But that's such an interesting way to reframe history, or at least, a big memorable part of the Huckleberry and Tom Sawyer novels and is written, Percival Everett is a black man as well. So it's not like whitewashing or anything, but it's him tweaking a character and having the character have their own agency and reframing a story. And when you see the character of Jim do certain things, if you read it in Huck, he's a simple man, he's uneducated, he's a black slave. When you read it in this, he knows what's going on and he knows he has to play into these things. And I think that idea of black people having to hide their identity from white people for a huge amount of reasons is something that, again, really resonate with me. And I know it's resonating with a lot of other readers, both white and people of color, because it is that kind of thing of how much of history is told, not only as we discuss through the lens of the white person who won, in air quotes, but also of the untold stories. And it links back to that story of Ellison's, the way it is, of what real life and real perspective is these stories of people. And so much of history, because it's written with a white pen, it misses so much of what's behind closed doors. And understandably, a lot of oppressed people don't want their oppressors getting everything. They will hide parts of themselves. And so looking back at a historical lens, so much of history has been overtly erased or missed because the people experiencing it don't want their oppressors to get a hold of it. And that, I thought that in the first chapter or two of this book, that's how powerful fiction can be. And I'm just blown away by it. And I recommend it to any listeners. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read in my life. And it just links in with that kind of idea that it sparked in me.
No, that's a brilliant concept, and one that I love kind of what you mentioned, that using a retelling of that story to depict a different part of history, an unknown part of history. Because yes, even during the times of enslavement, Black Americans had to hide what they know, right? They had to a certain extent, they had to shuck and jive and hide that they were learning to read, that they were organized. The whole Underground Railroad movement, as cliche as it sounds, that was, the reality was you couldn't tell the oppressor the truth because it would be used against you, right? You had to find ways to hide the real identity, hide the real truth from the slavers and the slave masters. You had to talk a certain way, play a certain role that was expected to you, so you would be ignored, right? Whereas, and then when you were with your people, you would use those Negro spirituals to transmit the map that is the Underground Railroad that would usher your way to freedom, right? You would use your time in the church when it was just looking like worship to send the signals, give the code, and talk about how to get free and how to liberate yourself. That's an interesting way to use. It's interesting how that author used, I believe Everett used that retelling of the Huckleberry Finn story from Jim's perspective to show, again, a different aspect of history that many may not know or understand.
100%. Yeah. So I hugely recommend that. And that's assisted it. Well, I took a little pause from reading Ellison and Baldwin. I read that in 2 days and it reignited that love and it reinforced some of these parts of this. So I know we've been speaking for well over an hour, but there is at least one other part of Shadow and Act that I specifically want to address because we've skirted around it. But Shadow and Act, it's based in 3 parts, but the second part, I'd say, Shadow and Act 2, is, I've written, here's my note about it, which is, it feels like it's more about jazz, it's more about music and known figures within. While reading Bird, about the Charlie Parker essay, I had a revelation that jazz for Ralph Ellison, and I suspect many other Black Americans, is a form of expression for their people almost exclusively without white performance. That was theirs. It was their music, which is an important part. It contains their history, their growth, identity, their suffrage and their pain. And the blues, which is the predecessor really to jazz, it divided and it became entertainment and folklore. Entertainment primarily for the white audience, folklore and lessons primarily for the black audience. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of my perception on Shadow Act 2.
I think that's astute. I think that's I agree. Just knowing Ralph Ellison's history and um, his training in music, both in classical as well as in jazz and blues, and his training in coming up, reading and learning the classics, as well as all of his pop culture. In the essay that I just mentioned before, when he talks about his history, the hidden name and the complex fate, when he talks about learning the classics in literature as well as coming up with pop culture literature, the westerns, the detective novels, reading Vanity Fair magazine, listening to opera, being trained in classical trumpet, as well as going to school in Tuskegee and learning blues and jazz. That rich musical history that he has, and understanding the different ways in which to tell stories and how Black America has often told stories through music, even going back to, again, the spirituals and music's integration into the Black church and how important that is. And like you mentioned, the lessons that are taught through music. I would say that extends even beyond blues and jazz into early, if not current, hip hop, right? A lot of what we saw in I think it was the late 60s, early 70s, when hip hop started to emerge primarily from New York. That came directly from a lot of the influence of blues, the influence of jazz, as well as the influence of disco at the time. And a lot of that was the story and the folklore of telling the story of what it was to be a Black man in America, right? What it was to be, during the crack epidemic, and hearing early hip hop telling stories about. I think back to artists like Basquiat and the hip hop at the time, Fab Five Freddy, and all of the hip hop artists that were coming up out of Brooklyn at that time, telling real stories about life and life on the streets. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of, again, very much like we started this podcast, Ralph Ellison kind of speaking from the past into the future, making that connection between how music, especially in jazz and blues, was a was a vehicle for Black America to tell its own story. How that was co-opted by white audiences in America and taken to a place of entertainment, as well as still being a place to speak truly to Black audiences about their stories. I think we see that today in a lot of hip hop music that's produced, right? You've got the pop stories and the mumble rap and the bling rap that's out there telling that entertainment story, which I'm not trying to knock at all. Some of my favorite music, if you will. But then you've also got that deeper storytelling, the underground hip hop, the Mos Defs and Talib Kweli's out there, the Black Stars, to a certain extent, the J. Cole's out there that are telling those deeper stories of trials, tribulations, and Black struggles in a different way. Some of them popular, some of them not. I like you mentioned, it's just interesting it's interesting to hear you speak about what Ralph Ellison is saying, and then drawing those connections out to, again, life as it is today, and how we continue to see these things repeat and be relevant then and now. If I hadn't answered already, I think your reading is astute, and I think it's still reflected today in Black culture and how America adopts, co-ops, and appropriates Black culture.
Yeah, and I think it links in with that prior point where it is I've heard Black people get frustrated so much, the two of the biggest rappers ever is Post Malone and Eminem, who are both white. And I understand that there can be that frustration. And, I'm not sure if it's happened with R&B specifically, but I'm not as astute with R&B. But when I was younger, I didn't understand. I was like, because again, when I was younger, it wasn't I didn't see race, but I didn't conceptualized of racism because white privilege. And so because of that, it was, why would a white rapper being top of the charts, why is that a problem? And then as I'm kind of understanding, it's like, well, because there are points culturally, be it through folklore or expression, which are little pockets of this is not necessarily this is ours per se, but kind of like we're expressing ourselves in this way, and you're taking away from that, stripping it bare, and using it for money in a sense. Not, there's a lot of stuff that Eminem says that I think was, was his own way of getting things out. But I can now understand a lot more and sympathize, understanding that this kind of pocket of like, if I. To be honest with me, not to try, it's whenever I say, what about me? When I'm, how I understand and conceptualize of these things is almost how I view podcasting post-COVID. Not that there shouldn't be famous people doing podcasting, but because of COVID and lockdowns and stuff, every single celebrity ever has got podcasts now. And what that's meant is interview shows don't get anywhere near as much traction unless you're already famous, because, why would someone listen to two nobodies, in air quotes, talk about really important things when you can hear Amy Poehler talk to Andy Samberg? And I love both of those people. They're great. But it's one of those things where I feel like the way I feel about that, which is this, I did this as a passion project. I've been doing it for nearly 10 years. I think I'm quite good at it. I have really important conversations, and I'm not doing it to make money, and I'm not doing it to be famous. But when you get someone who kind of shortcuts in, someone edits it all for them, someone gets all their guests for them, the guests they get are impossible to get from someone lower. And so it becomes this thing where from the starting point, the two starting points are so different that obviously this person up here is going to be more successful. And I think that's almost a metaphor, or at least how I can sympathize in the ways that I can with rap music and other music, which started off pretty much in the black community and by black expression, and has gone to the mainstream of going like, I can see how, that was our thing. It's being tainted in a way. Do you see what I'm kind of coming from?
I do. In fact, it reminds me of, I think it was a TikTok controversy. Was it 5 years ago, 7 years ago, where Black creators on TikTok made up a number of amazing dances, and then one of a more famous white TikTok star ends up going on the Jimmy Fallon show and showing off this dance and being given all of the credit for the dance's creation and proliferation, only to have the black TikTok community come out in outrage and remind America that, hey, we did this first. This was ours. And when it was a black thing, no one was paying attention. Until now, you have a white star that is showing it to the world for the first time. Right. I think that's intrinsic to America. And I sit here on these podcasts and talk like a professional, but I'm no professional. I only speak from my experience. What I have seen in my country over the years that I've grown up is that America loves a great white hope. Mm-hmm. And they look for those stars to reinforce that narrative of American exceptionalism from a very narrow perspective.
And the white savior, which is obviously still in movies today. We will start to wrap up, but I want to give the floor back to you for sort of the final talking point before we fully wrap up. I know there's so much that we could still talk about and haven't. Again, we could probably do another 10 podcasts on just Shadow and Act, but is there any either essay, a theme, or part, any specific thing about Shadow and Act which we have not yet touched upon that you would like to speak about?
I think the only thing we didn't hit on, which we probably touched on in our prior podcast, was how much of Shadow and Act, kind of that precursor to the Invisible Man. You touched on it a little bit when you mentioned the character in what was the name of the essay?
The Way It Is? Was that the?
Yes, The Way It Is. You mentioned a little bit when he's sitting at that character's dining room table that woman would go on to become Ma Rambo. Was that her name?
Yeah. Oh, the woman who the narrator stays with,
Mary Rambo.
Yes, you are right.
Yeah. She would go on to become the archetype for Mary Rambo in The Invisible Man. Right. Another one of his essays, Harlem is Nowhere, where he is really steeped in and describing the city of Harlem. I think it's even early. He writes that essay early in his relocation to Harlem, and he's talking about the city, its people, the jazz. You can see in that essay how how he learned about the city and how he kind of the precursor to describing what Harlem was like and creating the Harlem of the Invisible Man. I just there's just so much in Shadow and Act that was a precursor to his great novel, The Invisible Man, and helped create both the characters as well as the environment that was that where the unnamed narrator lived. I think it's interesting to look at, after I read Invisible Man and then read Shadow and Act, it's interesting to see that evolution of Ellison's writing and creativity. So much so that I am, the next book I'm going to read is Juneteenth, to understand and get a better sense of this writer's progression. Right, the more I learn about Ellison, the more I learn about his history and his barrier breaking, his culture straddling life that he lived. I can see it more and more in his writings and understand more and more of his perspective about how important it is to break out of these silos and break out of these stereotypes. It's something that as I grow older, try to figure out how I myself am going to make sure that that I can and live up to that ethos also, because I don't want to be, as a Black man in America, I don't want to be painted with one single brush and one single color. I want to be seen as a multidisciplinary person, right? And especially as I come late to my creative pursuits, writing, authorship, podcasting, in the future, content creation of my own, I want to make sure that I am doing Ellison justice and showing the complex story that is Tony Holt and the complexities of Black America, that is not just that monolith that everyone expects, but is really authentically me, and in a way that would do Ellison justice.
No, I mean, it's great there, because I'm obviously coming at it from a slightly different perspective, but I want, Megan's pregnant, the due date is in less than 2 months. And one of the things I know it's crazy. One of the things that I've thought about a lot is, and what this journey of reading Ellison and Baldwin, etc., has really taught me in a lot of ways, is my parents, bless them, love them to pieces, but they didn't tell me anything about prejudice. They didn't tell me really anything about homosexuals or the LGBTQ plus community. They never taught me about racism. I had to learn all this myself. And unfortunately, as evidenced hopefully by the amount of myself I put online, I am not prejudiced. I am not a bigot or anything like that. But I've had to come to these conclusions myself. I had to, there were some guiding lights in my life, but I really had to kind of make those decisions. And they can see how so many people who weren't so willing to learn can learn the wrong lessons, shall we say, especially white people doing this. So I'm hoping that when, having children and things like that, I can teach them the right lessons and hopefully, from a young enough age for them to conceptualize be like having them understand racism. I know that Black parents have to have the talk with their kids, is to explain in some ways, racism exists. There are people who won't like you because of your skin color and the kind of the nuances that go with that. And obviously each parent would tell in a slightly different way, but that I never had that.
I got it a couple times.
Well, yeah. Well, that's it. And it's like, it's one of those things I think a lot of white people I don't even realize is a thing. And I want that the child or children, if we have another, I want them to understand of these things. And I want them to comprehend of their own privilege without me top-loading loads of guilt onto them to make them then potentially resentful against the others, because that can also be a thing. So try and do that balancing act of teaching kids the right lessons. And I want to link with, because you mentioned Harlem is Nowhere, I'm just going to post in our chat, there's a quote that I would like you to be able to read. So I'll give a bit beforehand. Let me know if you can see that message. But so Harlem is Nowhere. So on one of the pages, essentially one of the things that Ellison says, I'm adding a little bit into this, so this isn't verbatim, but he says, the conditions under which they, Black people, live without proper support and systems or a place in society are seized upon as proof of their inferiority. And then I want Tony to read out this next thing, which is a direct quote from Ellison to illustrate this point, if you may.
Whites impose interpretations upon Negro experience that are not only false, but, in effect, a denial of Negro humanity.
And it's just something that's so powerful. And, again, I think the way it is in Harlem Is Nowhere, I think, are such incredible stories, because it's really him saying, I understand to a degree why we're in this situation, but what we need is both white people and black people to understand how we got here, where we go from here. And I think a lot of Shadow Act 3, it feels like, in a good way, he is directing a lot more of it at the white audience to try and kind of be like, look, it's so easy for white people to essentially look at black suffrage and go, I know why this is. It's because of this, without talking to a black person ever. And I think a lot of liberals in sort of the 20th century did this a lot. I think there's the Moynihan Report, I think it's called, something like that. And there's by Peter Moynihan or something like that, where I believe Ellison addresses it, and Baldwin specifically addresses it as well in his essay collection, No Name on the Street. There's only 3 or 4 essays in that, but in that he mentioned it and he referenced it so much. I read a wiki version of that report, and it is essentially a white person trying to go, yeah, black people, they're suffering a lot. We need to help them. Here's what's causing all their problems, and basically primarily blaming the fact of a lack of a parental figure, mainly black men. Basically saying, black men need to start being parents to their kids because black women are becoming the dad and the mum of the kids, and that's what's screwing all black people up. And it's like, you are misinterpreting data, you're making assumptions you don't understand, and you're not really talking to any people who are experiencing this thing. And so when I read Harlem Is Nowhere, and that quote in particular, I think that really evidences it, which is, not only do people who are overtly bigoted and racist, who are trying to keep black people oppressed, I think a lot of what happens is, whites impose their interpretations. Whether you're on the right or left, or your heart is in the right place, too often I think damage is caused by people trying to impose their own interpretations of situations on another group of people without talking to them. And that's like a huge, for me, quite a big theme, I think, of the third part of the Shadowing Act.
I agree. And I think it's really astute that you say that. And I think that is the hard part for everyone, right? Because especially now, as American society is becoming more and more siloed, be it social media, be it where we live, where we work, how we commute. Those silos are splitting us up more and making it harder and harder to talk to people that are outside of your silo, outside of your comfort zone. It's hard to understand those perspectives. It's hard to get those different perspectives. And so much now is talking about it's so easy for us to talk about what's right for someone else, especially without actually having to sit with and understand that other person's pain. I think there's a lot, again, like you said, there's just a lot of what Ellison has said before is coming back around, is very astute and very prescient now. And it makes a lot of sense that message is timely and timeless, that you've got to be able to understand and sit with someone else's pain. You've got to be able to hear from that person, from their perspective, in order to really understand how to change. That Moynihan report was so influential that you still see that as the problem now. You still see that same trope of the young black boy growing up without a father and the damage that is wrought to that person. You still see that playing out through through so many different movies and books and stories in pop culture today. No, that's such an interesting perspective, and it's just so intriguing, all the things that you're pulling from this novel, or I'm sorry, from this essay collection from Ellison, and the way in which you're applying it too. And I will say that I think it's great that you have this eye on the education that you're bringing to yourself and how you pass that on to your children, your child, your would-be children, passing that on to the next generation, right? In such a way that it is productive and positive, right? I don't think that's just difficult for you as a white parent. I think it's difficult for black parents as well. I think it was difficult for my parents also to help instill a sense of both knowledge and pride in black Americans, and help help me understand the true struggle that we went through without making me angry and bitter and resentful of the country that I live in and the majority in power. Right? I think that's a struggle that we all face, or one that I see resonate in my parents that is very similar to the one you have described.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm trying my best. I'm trying to understand where I can, and hopefully to the audience, who, as far as I can understand, are a variety of different demographics. So hopefully, no matter who you are, where you're from, or anything like that, some of what we've spoken about here has been valuable. Again, the essay collection, it's amazing. Some essays are better than others. There's one or two essays I read and it was a bit of a struggle to get through them, but then there was a few other ones which were from the get-go, like The Way It Is, loved that immediately. Some of the interviews are really interesting as well, I found. And then there's also I believe it was the Richard Wright's essay. The first half of that I was really struggling, and then the second half of that I think had some of the most incredible parts to it. And in fact, when I said earlier about there's a part that I think Ellison said about black people not existing in writing, it's in that essay. And one of my things right at the end is between the emancipation and civil rights movement, black people almost didn't exist in writing. So much of these essays, which are written decades apart, they interconnect because he's still thinking about those elements. So I want to pass the baton back to you as we do officially wrap this up, of final statement about Shadow and Act, and then what you've got going on as well. This won't be out for a while because I've got a backlog and things, but I'll make sure I include links in the description to banned movies and stuff like that. But final statement, I've said all I need to say about Shadow and Act. You get the final floor, sir, of anything else you want to say about Shadow and Act and Ralph Ellison, and then anything else you're doing, and then we'll wrap up.
Shadow Act is great. I agree. The progression from Acts 1, 2, and 3 of his essay collection really show the breadth of Ralph Ellison's experience and abilities, while still having those common through lines that you see all the way to his premier work, his seminal work in Invisible Man. So if anybody out there likes Invisible Man, I would strongly encourage you to check out Shadow and Act, and make some time to sit through it and struggle through it and just take it one essay at a time. As far as me, I am, like we talked about just before we started recording, I'm kind of entering into a new phase in my life, in my career, and am now Prof T. For the first time in my life, I'm actually getting an opportunity to teach class at the university level, which is great. And I am right now teaching a humanities course that's kind of heavy on liberal arts studies, and very much heavy on writing. And I am a writing advocate or reading advocate, and I have seen the power that both reading and writing have had in my life, and I am very excited to share it with my students. Some of them are coming along more than others. Some of them are more interested than others. But what I love is that all of them are receptive to and really engaging with all of the different readings and different articles and textbooks that we have. And it's awesome to be able to both share my experience with a next generation of students and see them learn, grow, engage, and struggle with the reading, the writing, and clarifying their own thoughts. I said it before on one of Seth's podcasts. I read to learn, I write to understand. And I am seeing that play out in real time with my students, and it's a real treat. So Prof T, you can expect Prof T to be coming at you a little bit more, not only in this podcast format, as I work with great podcasters like yourself, Mike, also working with great podcasters like Spider Dan and Tanya Todd through their banned book series that is coming out in, I believe, August and September of 2025, as well as future endeavors that we have planned together, both going deeper on Ralph Ellison and ideally in some other veins on pop culture as well, which I'm very excited on. And then pursuing my own creative work, or I should say coming back to my own creative work in my old age, if you will, and trying to create some more content and do more writing myself to better express the complexities of me out there on the interwebs. But for now, you can check out my work. I try to post all of the podcasts I'm in, as well as the work that I have. You can check out my Linktree site. I'll make sure you have that for the show notes, but it's linktr.ee/Tony Holt Jr., all one word. And you can find all of my writings and my works there.
Amazing stuff. Well, thank you, Tony. It's always an absolute treat to chat with you. We never have enough time. Even when we make a load of time and go over time, there's never enough time. But I'm very excited for the content creation avenue that you are going on as we sort of steer towards the end of 2025. So 2026 is going to be an amazing year for many reasons, but including with your output. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, for your understanding, your empathy, and your knowledge as well. It's hugely appreciated. And, you know, without you, I wouldn't be on the journey I am with Ellison or with many of the other things I'm reading and putting a lot of my effort into to trying to grow as a person. So thank you for that, Tony. And, you know, again, thank you to Tonya and Tony of Comics Lit, because that was kind of the kindling, you know, the kindling of that. And I think the Banned Books conversations, which obviously is Tonya's, was the spark. And then your conversations with me has been the fuel to the fire. So thank you so much for that. So I appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure's all mine, Mike. Thank you.
And that's the end of the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, my friend. Make sure you check out all the clips here on YouTube, as well as all the other conversations I've had. And if you haven't listened to the first conversation I had with Tony earlier in 2025, please make sure you check that out. I've been on a little hiatus due to my newborn, Melody, which I did reference in this conversation. It shows how long ago it was recorded. But don't fret, in 2026, I'm slowly getting back into things. I've got a lot of really cool conversations recorded, which I am prioritizing release of. And then I'm going to be getting back into the swing of recording again, including I will have Tony Holt on to talk about more Ellison and some other really interesting topics too. So if you want a taster to see the kind of things that I've got on this channel, make sure you check out the clips or shorts they are here. Make sure you follow me on social media, because all of those clips are also there on TikTok at Genuine Chit-Chat and on Instagram at Genuine Chit-Chat as well. And if you want the audio only versions of this, you can go on Spotify or any other podcast app, and Genuine Chit-Chat is there. I've got a massive back catalogue. I've been doing this for almost 10 years and I've had loads of incredible conversations. If you want specific conversations on things, there's also playlists here on YouTube. But friends, thank you so much. Again, like, comment, tell us your thoughts on this. Make sure you subscribe, and I'll talk to you very soon.